There is no better time than the present to talk about all the hottest takes in Marvel Snap. The revival of Leech has led to an explosion in extremely hot takes. Let's get into the best of the best. The developers' purposeful unbalancing of the meta is becoming tiring. Only reason Leech has been buffed is to encourage season pass purchases to own Blink. Updates should be less regular. I think this is a fascinating take, and I bring this take up very specifically because I think it's a thing a lot of people are thinking about in one way or another right now. And I know that because I got a lot of takes along the same lines, both for and against this. So here's a take against this. Second Dinner still needs to get faster with OTAs. Good example, Leech right now. It doesn't matter what the data says, it's clear that most people aren't happy with Leech, so it should get fixed already this week and not at the next OTA or patch date. OTAs are Snap's superpower, so use it. See? Like, these are two people who are agreeing on a problem but disagreeing on the causes and solutions to that problem, right? What they agree on is they don't like this, they don't like Leech. And what they disagree on is should they do any of this to fix it, right? The first person thinks, okay, because they did an OTA that made Leech, they should do less OTAs. And the second person thinks, okay, well, they made the Leech in an OTA, so they should fix it in an OTA, right? And I think both of those are interesting and unique. So what I'm going to do is outline what I would do if I were Second Dinner and like generally how I would approach this. First things first, I think that it would be very good to keep OTAs regularly scheduled. I think 2 weeks is a fine period of experimentation. And I do think secondarily that it's a terrible idea to do balance based on like community people getting mad on Twitter. I think that's a very bad idea. I think if you have an issue with Leech and it doesn't show up in the data, that is indicative that your issue is more about your feelings than anything that's actually related to balance. And I do think that there is some degree to which you can say, all right, well, this card feels bad and is pretty good, like Alioth was. Alioth was like a top 5 performing card in the game, and also everyone hated it. Leech is close to that level, and I think that that would be a reasonable logic to approach looking for a reversion to him. I think that's fine, but I think that that's the kind of thing you need a little bit of time with before you just say, like, it's been a week, we all hate this. Remember that Alioth was around for an extended period of time with multiple attempts at really seeing what he could be, and then they were like, all right, you know what, fine, we'll get rid of him, but, like, they tried, right? They didn't just be like, it's been a week, everyone doesn't like it, let's get rid of it. And I think it would be a mistake to start doing that now. As far as more or less OTAs, I think what they really would benefit from is figuring out what the structure actually is and what the goals of OTAs are. Because to me, I think at a baseline level, the idea of what they did with Leech, the idea of what they did with Claw, the idea of what they did with Ultron, that stuff is really good. That's just a really good thing to do. You want them to be buffing these old cards. You're mad that it's Leech because you don't like playing against Leech and getting your deck leeched, right? I get it, right? But in theory, that is kind of the thing they should be doing, is like take an old card and bring it up to the standards of the new. Because I have a fairly strong reason to believe that if they were to release Leech in a modern day, they were to put it on sale for however many tokens, it would be the 4-2. They would not release that card at a 5-3. No one would buy it at a 5-3. They'd release it at like closer to the 4-2 stat line, right? And I think that that is what they need to be doing with cards like that. They need to be taking these old cards and bringing them up to speed with what would be released today, because otherwise everything is just all about the new cards, right? And I think also there's this assertion that Leech was buffed to go along with Blink. I honestly don't know, but it wouldn't shock me. Like, that is the kind of thing where it's like, oh, you're very clearly making this go along with your new card. That's like a solid strategy to like get people to buy. I get it. I understand what is likely happening there. I can't really speak to that because I just don't know what their internal comms on OTAs are like. But it wouldn't shock me if that came up. And I think the other thing that really strikes me about this conversation specifically is that the first person is saying, because OTAs created the problem, that makes OTAs bad. And the second person is saying, it's not the OTA's fault, it's what they did in the OTAs. And between those two takes, I'd be far more tempted to agree with the second person. However, I do think it's a bad idea to just be like, oh, well, everyone hates this after a week. I do think that, it might be true, but you can't really determine that with like 1 week's worth of information, right? It might be true that Leech is too strong and too oppressive and the amount of viable decks in the metagame are getting lower. Or it might be true that there's just different viable decks, right? People talk about, oh, Silver Surfer is gone. And it's like, well, I've never seen a better metagame for Cerebro 3, right? Like, there are some analogs here. However, on the whole, I think that on-reveal cards tend to be a lot more interesting and varied than ongoing cards. And so this creates a situation where, like, if you are someone who likes brewing decks, you end up in a spot where a lot of the most interesting effects are off limits to you because you're afraid of getting leeched. And I think that is what is, if there is any long-term dynamic that Leech creates that is deleterious, it's going to be that. And that is the thing that I'd be keeping an eye on if I worked for them. Like, is there a decrease in the amount of, like, tier 2 playable archetypes, right? Because I think tier 1 is going to look roughly similar in terms of the numbers of decks that are in there, but decks that were previously tier 2 or playable, falling out of that is the thing I'd be keeping an eye on if I worked at Second Dinner. Cannonball plus Profex combo is stronger and much more irritating to play against than Old Arrow plus Old Wave. Only difference is that not that many people can afford Cannonball, unlike Old Arrow. Hashtag bring Arrow back. Yes, I actually do think that in a post-Cannonball world, we can have Arrow back. I also think that, like, we talk about Wave, right? A lot of why Arrow was good was related to Wave, preventing your opponent from playing cards in the relevant locations. Now, Sandman is doing that now. I'd be interested to see what happens. My pitch for Arrow is to bring her back to her original stat line and ability, which I don't know if many people remember this. 5/6, move all the cards that your opponent played this turn to the location that you play Arrow on. That is what I want her to do. And the reason I like that is because unlike, say, Cannonball Profex or Old Leader or any of the other prio win cons, the counterplay to a card like Arrow is very straightforward. Fill up the lane. That's it. Lane's full, nothing can move there, you're going to beat that card. And that is a super interesting dynamic to have, because normally filling up a lane is a bad thing to do before turn 6. You want to have that flexibility, but against an Arrow deck, it's the best thing to do before turn 6. There's this really fascinating back and forth that can create. I personally think 5/5, 5/6 Old Arrow is a fine card to bring back into Marvel Snap. The game is completely fine and enjoyable without the new card. Collection Complete is a scam we sold ourselves. The game is fine and enjoyable without the new card. Collection Complete is not a scam we sold ourselves. I think wanting to have all the cards in your card game when you spend a bunch of money on it is like a pretty reasonable ask. I get that they don't want that, but like I think it's not unreasonable for people to say, if I'm going to spend $1,000, I want all the cards. That said, I do think there is something here where it's like, yes, the game is enjoyable if you don't have the new card. I think there's like a very specific sort of cohort of people for whom that is not true when the new card is very good and they find themselves losing to a new card and feeling like they're not able to compete with it. But like, I think one of the things that I really like about the Claw Ultron buff and buffs of that nature is they are buffs to cards everyone has. And like, again, I get it. They don't have to do too many of those, but just enough that like a Series 3 only deck is not unplayable in the top 10, I feel like. That's all I really want, right? We had someone hit rank 1 with a Series 3 only deck. That is, I think, the first time that's happened, and it is because of the Claw and Ultron buffs. That is really important to me, and they need to keep doing that. My suggestion to them would be find 2 or 3 cards every few weeks that you're like, let's see what we can do here, and make meaningful upward adjustments to them. Maybe it's just 1, maybe it's 2, just like find, maybe, okay, we'll say 1 to 3 cards and be like, what would this be if we made it today? And upwardly adjust it. That would be my thought process. I did a longer video on this, but yeah, that's sort of where my head is at here. I think that the game should get better at dealing with those issues. But in the meantime, what they can do in a process they have already established is like relatively easier, like barring a full economy rework or whatever. What they can do is make Series 3 cards a little bit more relevant because they keep releasing absolute bangers in Series 5. And so soon you see these decks. I think Thanos was the first deck where it's just like, this is like 6 new cards in it. But now there's like, you know, the Blink decks, right? They're running Red Guardian and Nocturne. And you don't need Red Guardian and Nocturne. You have like Polaris or Gladiator or Mobius, right? Like you don't need Red Guardian and Nocturne, but like they're the best in slot. They're replaceable, but they're the best in slot. And it's like, of those, like Polaris, Mobius, and Gladiator, well, only one of those is actually in Series 3. So it's like, can there be another great 3-drop? That would be super cool. Like, bringing the, I guess you'd call them budget replacements closer in power to the things they're replacing, but not close enough that they eclipse them should be the goal, right? Assuming their goal is like, you know, we want our new cards to be good so we can sell them, which is, I think, a fairly cynical assumption, but I'm going to make it. Assuming that's the goal, they should at least make it so there's less of a delta between the new card releasing and whatever it is someone who doesn't get the new card is going to replace it with in a deck. Heimdall should move everything left when played right, right when played left, and not move anything when played center. I think this card would be fascinating. I think I have 2 worries about it, just baseline. Baseline worry number 1, it's probably too complicated for a Series 1 card. I think that is a very complex mechanic to introduce in a game that has no other mechanics of that nature. There are very few other cards that work like this. For those who don't remember, Crystal used to work like this, but Crystal was Series 3, right? Like, I think there is a meaningful difference between a Series 1 archetype staple and how complex you want that to be. Like, you look at the other ones, Odin, Spectrum. There's no really thinking involved in that. You just play them on the location where you want them, and then they do the thing. And I think I do worry that there is like some issues with Heimdall there. I think secondarily, this card would actually probably be pretty broken. Like, this would be like a really strong card. I think it would be hard to fit the text box on the card. It would be a little bit too complex for a Series 1 card. And I think it would probably be too strong as well. I do like where you're going with this, but I don't think that's what I would do with Heimdall. The meta is in a pretty good spot right now. I feel like I have game no matter what jank brew I'm trying that day. I think that what's happening in the meta right now is twofold. On the one hand, I do think there is like a lot of just general dislike of Leech that is sort of based on the legacy the card has rather than what it's doing right now. But on the other hand, I think that there are some meaningful indicators that Leech is making decks below tier 1 harder to succeed with at the highest levels. And what I mean by that is like, yeah, the Leech decks are good, the Loki decks are good, you can keep doing that stuff, right? Decks that are legitimately highly optimized and prepared to beat the card can beat the card. But if you're just like, I'm going to play something that I used to enjoy playing a lot, like, I don't know, discard, right? Oh, got leeched, Modoc's gone, sorry, I guess I lose. Or Silver Surfer. Oh, got leeched, Silver Surfer's gone, guess I lose, right? Like, it's a feeling of helplessness that I think is bad. And I think it's weird, right? Because Loki has the same thing. One of the lessons I've been talking about on my stream a lot lately is when someone Lokis you, you need to actually figure out what they're going to do, because there's a decent chance you can beat that card, but people act like you can't ever beat that card. And I think Leech is sort of the same way, where it's like, you get Leech, you need to like really be like, all right, so what are they actually going to do after this? What are they going to make happen here? Because a lot of the time it is a beatable card, depending on what you're trying to do. What's the issue that comes up is that if you win, you're scraping it out, right? You're barely winning against those cards. You're like very much scraping it out, winning a 50-50, things like that. That's what beating those cards when they're played feels like. And when you lose, if you lose, you just feel like an idiot for having stayed and tried. And I think that dynamic is something that people probably aren't talking enough about, where it's like the 2 cards that are defining this metagame, Leech and Loki, are both cards that come down and you feel bad and they're beatable, but you don't ever really want to, because when you stay, you feel so stupid if they have the thing that actually beats you. There's a lot of just like riding on a wing and a prayer about going against Leech and Loki. Like the threat of what they can do is so much higher on average than what they actually do, right? They don't always blink the Leech, right? They don't always have targets to blink the Leech into. But you don't know that, and if they do, you feel like an idiot for having stayed. They don't always get the good cards out of your deck with Loki. They don't, but you don't know that, and if they did, you feel like an idiot for having stayed. And that dynamic, I think very specifically, is what people don't like about the metagame right now. It's that like they feel like the smart play is to just leave when this stuff happens, and they don't like it. I feel like the community gets so wrapped up with the cards that come out, understandably so, that we often don't think about how interesting and creative some of the new locations end up being. Yeah, I can say for sure that I am very much wrapped up in new cards and do not think at all about new locations. And a lot of this is because I hate hot locations and I hate featured locations, and I mostly don't play on those days. So yeah, I think this is probably a correct take. I don't appreciate that, because it doesn't make my experience of the game better. It's implemented in such a way that it honestly mostly makes my experience of the game worse. The game is in a good state for old players. They need to focus on new players and returning player experience. Catch up mechanics to speed up a little bit Series 3 acquisition. What is it, free to play now? 8 months, question mark? And especially to give more agency to those players on which Series 3 they get. I think it is rare that I go to the comments on one of these posts about hot takes, and I see a hot take that I just like 100% agree with. This is one of those takes. This is one of those times. I 100% agree with this take. They absolutely 100% need to make catch-up mechanics so that you can get into the game. The interesting thing about it, though, especially for returning players, there's nothing for a returning player. But the fascinating thing about their Spotlight Cash system is that there's this thing that happens at the beginning of Series 3. Where like, okay, you've entered Series 3. You're waiting to get like reasonable Series 3 cards. You have 4 Spotlight Caches. Suddenly you have 4 new cards. And then you go look up what decks you can play those 4 new cards in. And it's like, oh, all these need Series 3 cards that I don't own. Like what they've managed to do somehow is be extremely generous given the way Spotlight Caches work when you have no Series 4 and 5 cards. They're just all cards. They're just all new. You're just getting cards for free, basically. You're just getting Series 4 and 5 cards every time. Everything is good. And then you're in a situation where you have like these build-arounds, but none of the complementary pieces, which is so weird. And so, yes, I do think that they need to do something for making it easier for those players to get like the Series 3 cards that they're looking for. Because right now it's just a once a month free card. Maybe there's like some way to do more like advanced targeting. I don't really know. And then the other thing is, for a returning player, they're put in an even worse situation. Because at least that new player coming into Series 3, getting their first few Spotlight Caches, they're always getting a new card out of that. A returning player who already did that, maybe they're like halfway through, maybe they have like half of Series 4 and 5, suddenly they're in a situation where they need a bunch of cards, but the spigot is turned off, right? There's no way for them to get the kind of like, oh, all 4 of these cards are cards I'm missing, I'm just going to go get that cash. That doesn't happen anymore when you have more cards. There's like diminishing returns. And so for a returning player, you end up in a situation where you're like, oh, I'm missing like the last 6 months of Series 4 and 5. How bad is that? And it's actually pretty bad because they keep releasing good cards. So I think, yes, they need to help those Series 3 players, but I think it's actually probably a higher priority in terms of, maybe not a higher priority because I don't know the numbers of like people entering Series 3 versus returning players to your game. But I think the people who are in the worst spot actually are returning players. Most people judge the state of the meta based on how they would like to play the game and refuse to adapt. They picked up Marvel Snap and convinced themselves this is the only game they should play even when they don't enjoy it. This is a little bit harsh. I do think that there is a degree of, I guess you'd call it like, oh, I've always played like this and I'm not going to adapt to Leech, and then you're mad when you lose to Leech. Like, yeah, I think there's some of that going on. But I also think it's a lot harder to adapt to a card like Leech than you're giving people credit for, right? Because we've talked about this dynamic already, but like a lot of the interesting cards in the game are on reveals instead of ongoings. And I think maybe it's something to the like, maybe they need to just make more interesting ongoings. But like you look at a card like Sage, it's like, oh, what an interesting on reveal. It's like, if that was ongoing, I wouldn't hate playing it into Leech as much, but since it's on reveal, I kind of hate playing it into Leech. And like that's sort of the issue. There's so much more being done with the space of on reveals than there is with the space of ongoings. And I kind of wonder if like that is sort of why people feel like things get stale when Leech is around, because again, Leech hits on reveals. He doesn't hit everything. You can build to deal with him by either doing decks with ongoings or decks with just like things that have static abilities like death, right? Like you could still play a death deck, a mockingbird deck. He's not getting rid of that. But what he is getting rid of, and I think this is a key thing, is a lot of the like fun build around interactive tools are on reveals. And I know people complain about Shang-Chi, but I think Shang-Chi's generally done good things for the metagame. Like people complain about that kind of stuff, but I think it's generally good when it's good. And I think that like things like Silver Surfer, like Discard, just like a bunch of these like fringy tier 2 type decks got hit by this in a way that really sort of restricts people to playing tier 1 decks. So it's like Leech, things that are able to deal with Leech really well. That's it. And then stuff that loses to that stuff. There's no like middle class of decks anymore, I think. Like I think that would be the issue that I think most people are objecting to, because a vast majority of that middle class was subsidized by on reveals that happened on turn 5 and 6. And now that just doesn't feel like a reliable thing to do. And so people that like wanted, maybe they weren't always playing the best deck, but they wanted to play a deck that was pretty good and okay. I think that's hard, right? Like, yeah, it's hard to adapt. And I'm sure that we'll find some other ways to like get those sort of middle class decks going again, but it'll be different decks. It'll be like Cerebro decks. It'll be like Zoo decks. It'll be decks that are not built around these on reveals. And I think that it is hard to adapt to that just because they were like, yeah, we're going to make Leech a 4 cost, right? Like that's just it's a hard pill to swallow, I think. I think I wouldn't blame the people for being upset with that. I do think that there is likely to be, it'll be a bit before we figure out what those tier 2 type decks are. I do think we'll be able to figure it out, but I think it will take time because that is the kind of thing that really does take a little bit of time, and we're not particularly incentivized to do that. What we're incentivized to do is find a deck that just beats the crap out of Leech. That's what we're incentivized to do. They should stop trying to catch old cards up to match current power creep and just revert a bunch of new cards back to the original scale of power Snap was on release. No, I think that's dumb. I think first of all, I think people think that like original power scale of Snap was like fine. And no, original power scale of Snap was actually like probably the most broken stuff we've ever had. Like, when Snap was in the beta, Mr. Negative was a 4/4 and was completely bonkers. Just a 4/4 Mr. Negative. That was just a card that existed. Other things we had Wave that stopped your opponent from playing any cards. We had a leader that was a 6/4 that copied every card your opponent played. All of them. Like no like conditions on it or anything. Just 6/4, copy all the cards your opponent played this turn. You just get them. Arrow was a 5/6 later buff to a 5/8 that moved all the cards your opponent played this turn. Wave also worked with Death. Like what she would do is she'd bring Wave, would bring Death to 4, and then Death would get like some discounts. So you'd have like the ability to do like a Wave that meant your opponent could only play 1 card the next turn because she set everything to 4, and then you could play Death in a 6-drop. That was stupid. I think people like to act like this is like power creep per se, but I think that the original version of a lot of Marvel Snap cards were very stupid. And I think when you talk about like nerfing, I think the other thing is your suggested solution for this is nerf a bunch of new cards down to whatever imagined previous gold standard there was, which I don't think ever really existed. But you have like a situation where you're suggesting that they take the things people have paid for and make them bad. And I think demonstrably the number one thing I've seen as a reaction to when they do that is anger. whenever a card, even a card everyone hates, like a Goliath, gets nerfed, people are furious about it because they invested in that. I saw people furious about the Red Hulk nerf, which did nothing to the card. Absolutely nothing, but they were still out here like, Second Dinner just releases broken cards and then nerfs them so they can make money. You're suggesting they effectively codify that. I think that is a very bad idea. 1.5 years without improving the singular additional game mode added to the game is too long. I'm assuming you're talking about Conquest here. I think Conquest has way more problems. Like, you're talking about improving it. And I can't think of a way to actually meaningfully do that. Like, yeah, we could delete Silver Conquest. I think that would be cool. But the fundamental problem Conquest has is that it's a competitive mode without a competitive player base. That's it. That's the issue. It's a mode that doesn't know who it's for. The competitive players are all at the top end of ladder because that's where they can guarantee they play each other. And why would they spend time in Conquest playing Joe Blow when they can actually go play the best players in the world and get a number next to their name that goes up? Why would they do that, right? And if you make them play that, like if you say this is the competitive mode, that's the only place you can actually be competitive, that seems like a ridiculous thing to do, because I know as one of those competitive players, I'd be mad as hell if I had to play 20-minute games of Marvel Snap. I started playing Marvel Snap because the games were short. That was the draw for me. I wanted that. And now to, like, when we talk about what Conquest is as a mode and like what can be done, I don't think there's solutions to this. Because everyone sort of had this, not everyone, but I think a lot of people had the sort of same experience with Conquest, which was, oh, this is fun, I'll play this. And then they played it for 2 months. And then 2 months later, the leaderboard came out and they removed the bots from the main mode of Marvel Snap, which is Marvel Snap. And then there was no real reason to play Conquest anymore, because the actual competitive integrity was in the ladder now. And I think that is pretty simple. Like, I don't know what you can do to improve Conquest. It's just like, why would I play it? Like, why would I play Conquest? Like, and I think that's just a hard sell for a lot of people. Like, a lot of the reason to play Conquest is there's no hot locations there, or I have a deck that I don't really want to risk my rank on. Like, that's what we're talking about here. So when we talk about like improving Conquest, I one of the things that Conquest tells me is like, I don't think people know what they want out of another mode of Marvel Snap. And I can tell you that I don't know what I would want out of another mode of Marvel Snap, because the best part about Marvel Snap, I think basically everyone agrees on this, is the gameplay. The gameplay is amazing. The best part about Marvel Snap is the gameplay. Everything else is not very good. And when you talk about a mode, what you're talking about effectively is changing the best thing about the game. Changing the gameplay, making it different. And so what exactly, like, how does it make sense to go into a situation where you're like, you know what everyone loves about our game? This thing. You know what everyone doesn't love about our game? These other things. What we're gonna do is do a mode that changes this thing. And it's like, why would you ever do that, right? Like, Marvel Snap's best feature is the gameplay. So what you'd want to do is do something that facilitates that. I don't know what that would look like in terms of a mode, but like, that's what people seem to want, to me at least. And so when you look at Conquest, it's like, yeah, this is Marvel Snap, but Snap, you know, the implication of Snap is it's fast. And so it's like, what we did was we took this fast, fun gameplay and we made it slow and take forever. And now, if you're playing this on the toilet, you better keep sitting there, buddy. You've got a lot of grinding to do. And it's like, wait, why are we doing that? And so like that, it just sort of feels like when people ask for modes, they're asking for changes to the one thing about this game that every single person who plays it agrees is good. And I like, it sort of leaves me pessimistic that any of this stuff makes sense conceptually, because what do you mean? Why would you change the gameplay? The game, that's the one thing that's good. Well, why would we do things that modify that? Do things that modify the things people don't like. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through that video. This was another one of the longer ones. We're trying it out again. People liked it last time. I hope you enjoyed this one. As always, I've been Cam Best. I hope you enjoyed the video. Remember, if you did, please like and subscribe. You might think that like, oh, he gets to play video games for a living, he's doing great. Let me tell you, I celebrate basically every time I see those numbers go up. It really does matter to me. So thank you so much for everyone who does that. If you don't do that, if you manage to make it through this video and you don't do that, please do. I really do appreciate it. As always, I've been Cam Best. I will see you in the next one.